Hi everyone, my name is Brianne Walsh. I am a senior science communicator with the UMC's Integration and Application Network, and today we are going to talk about conceptual diagrams, a tool for effective science communication. So when we talk about the most effective science communication, it has three main components. It provides synthesis, visualization, and context. And conceptual diagrams are a great way to communicate science because they actually cover all three of those requirements. So why are conceptual diagrams so effective? Because humans are visual creatures. We have been communicating through visuals longer than 30,000 years. So visual communication actually existed before, written and spoken communication. And because of that, humans are inherently visual. We recognize visuals and understand them and retain information from them. And today, in the age of the internet and social and digital content, it's actually like posts or content that has visuals receive more engagement than content that is actually just text. So just to take a step back, when we're talking about conceptual diagrams, we're thinking of thought drawings. So conceptual diagrams combine symbols and concepts to illustrate scientific processes. And good conceptual diagrams present information clearly and provide context. And so this is just an example of a diagram that many of you are probably familiar with, have seen before, and it's illustrating plate tectonics. So it's providing context in that it's showing how those processes are happening within the Earth's crust. And it's also illustrating the topographic features on the Earth that result in those processes. So conceptual diagrams can transform written text into visual elements. So you can take 2 pages of text talking about cumulative impacts and eco-based management that could contain a lot of scientific technical jargon and turn it into really reader-friendly synthesized visualizations. So this is an example showing cumulative impacts on a coastal ecosystem. And you can see as the diagrams move from right to left and progress and add impacts to each diagram, you can clearly see those changes. You can see the color of the water change. You can see the increase in agriculture and urbanization, and also see how that's impacting the natural systems around it. So what makes conceptual diagrams so effective is that for both the audience and the person creating the conceptual diagram, they can be extremely useful tools. So they help clarify thinking. As you're going through the process of creating a conceptual diagram, it'll really have you thinking about your research and the question that you're trying to answer and the different pieces going into that diagram. They aid in communication, so they provide visual, synthesized diagrams that also include context, and they can help identify data gaps, management priorities, and key features and threats within a system. So to start thinking about how you create a conceptual diagram, I have 7 steps outlined here. So first, you want to identify the audience. So think about who is going to be viewing this conceptual diagram. Is it going to be your scientific peers? Is it going to be members of the general public or policymakers or managers that may not have the same scientific background that you have? So think about how you need to kind of tailor this diagram to the audience. You also want to think about the medium that it's going to be in. Is it going to be part of a PowerPoint presentation? Are you going to be putting this into a newsletter? So is there going to be a need to simplify it or an ability to add text to go along with it to kind of describe what's going on in the conceptual diagram? And so second, you want to develop an issue statement. So think about a 1-sentence declarative statement that kind of describes what's going on in your conceptual diagram. And I like to think about this kind of like an elevator speech. So they say you should be able to kind of explain your research to someone in the 3 minutes that it takes to ride an elevator, and kind of think about that as far as your conceptual diagram. What is the overarching message that you want to have in this diagram? Next, you want to prioritize your key features and the major drivers in this diagram. So try to keep this list to about 5 to 7 features and identify the major natural resources, the threats, the issues that need to be in this conceptual diagram. You want to keep that list short so that you're not starting off too complicated, but you also don't want to lose that scientific integrity of the conceptual diagram. So once you have your list, you can start formulating a short list of symbols. So are there specific species of animals you need? Do you have to have a certain kind of look of a building or a boat? Are there different processes that need to be in that diagram? And next, you want to start drawing a sketch with the base and symbols. So the base is one of the most important pieces of the symbol in the diagram because that actually starts to provide that context. So you want to think, do you need a 2D base, a 3D base? Do you need just a map? Are you trying to show processes happening in the air, under the water, in the soil? So start thinking about where you need to be showing things on that base. And then the last step is kind of to create with the software. So you always want to start on with pencil and paper and then transfer to the software once you have a draft. So there's 3 components of a conceptual diagram: the base, symbols, and a legend. So as I said, the first thing you want to start with is your base, and there are many choices. There are 2D choices, 3D, you can use maps, but you really want to look at your base and think, what parts of the system do I need to be showing? Do I need to have underneath the water showing, or can I just have above the land? Do I want to show a comparison of a good versus bad? So start with your base. And the second is symbols. So these are just some examples of symbols that are in the Ian symbol library, and Ian has actually started a symbol library that's available on our website. It's free. We just ask for attribution, and you can go and download these symbols. There are symbols and all sorts of bases that are ready and free for your use. And symbols are a really great form of communication because they are easily recognized and information rich. So symbols are language dependent and universal. They can transcend cultures, time. We are surrounded by symbols in our daily life, whether we realize it or not. They're used in mathematics, religion, corporate branding, signs, organizations. And symbols are great because they can represent something tangible. So a certain species of bird, a building, a monitoring instrument, or they can represent something invisible or intangible. So for example, on the right, we have that green arrow and the blue arrow. So we have carbon dioxide being absorbed, oxygen being released, and that's how we are symbolizing photosynthesis. And you can use the size and color of symbols to convey information. So when we think about visuals in humans, like humans are innately attracted to certain colors. So when we see red to greens, we think of red, danger, alarm. So we use red to illustrate bad things or a degraded system, and then follow along those stoplight colors to show green being good or desired. So this is a conceptual diagram comparing a degraded to a desired coral reef ecosystem, and you can see that the illustrator has used the size, the number, and the color of symbols to convey additional information. So on the left, there is a sediment loading arrow. The brown arrow is larger in the degraded system versus the desired system. There's more fish species in the desired system, which is showing fish biodiversity. And also just by changing the color of the water in the base, you can see that the degraded system has more nutrients, more sediment load, turbidity versus the desired system. Symbols can be used in many ways. They can be used in tables. This table on the right is just showing a symbol for each indicator in a report card. The table on the left has a little vignette of a best management practice, which is kind of a mini conceptual diagram for each example. Symbols can be used in report cards. This is a score paddle wheel from the Mississippi River report card, and each of these kind of goals, recreation, ecosystems, flood control, transportation, etc., has each of their own symbols that kind of transcend the life of the report card. So each time one of those goals is talked about, they have that accompanying symbol. Symbols can also be used in data graphs. This is just a visualization of projected sea level rise in the state of Maryland, and you can see that the y-axis contains the year and the projected sea level rise, and they've just added a conceptual diagram on the back to kind of put that into context. So compared to this dock, what does that sea level rise look like? And you can use conceptual diagrams to transform flowcharts, which are usually just, box and arrow diagrams, into really information-rich visuals. So just by looking at this and adding a base and a few symbols behind those arrows, this conveys so much more information and can be retained much more easily by the audience. Symbols can also be used in infographics. So this is a infographic showing Maryland's greenhouse gas reduction plan and how that will impact different parts of Maryland. So they just added a little symbol to each kind of contribution to Maryland's economy, jobs, the environment, and it just makes it a little more information or visually appealing to kind of present that information. And the last step of creating the third piece of a conceptual diagram is a legend. You always want to include a legend and describe what those symbols are conveying, because it may not be apparent and people may have other ways of looking at symbols. So here we have a diagram that actually just has a list of symbols. So just like a map would list out the symbols, they have the factors associated with sea level rise and the factors associated with land movement. And then on the right, there's a conceptual diagram legend, which is an embedded legend. So it actually types out the caption of the diagram and includes those symbols within the legend. So to see, this is the full version of that conceptual diagram with the embedded legend. So conceptual diagrams provide synthesis, visualization, and context. So this is a conceptual diagram showing how land use changes can actually increase algal blooms in a system. And so you can see that right in context, and then you have this great embedded legend describing what's happening in the diagram. So why are conceptual diagrams such a great tool? Not only do they provide that visualization, but they also can be created in real time to synthesize key messages and important parts of a system into a shared vision. So this is a conceptual diagram that was sketched out on a whiteboard as part of a stakeholder workshop in Samoa, and it's showing the important ecosystems from the cloud forest, the coastal strand, and offshore marine in Samoa. So this was the first kind of sketch of the conceptual diagram. And then stakeholders met and each kind of focused each on one environment and landscape within that system. And then they started, this was actually going to be a report card, they started putting the different features of each one of those landscapes. And then a science communicator took that sketch and then started working on it in software. And this was kind of the next step to fill in all those pieces and get that base correct. And this is how the finished product looked. So this was how that ended up appearing in the actual publication. So what are some other ways that conceptual diagrams can be used? These are just going to be some examples to kind of get you thinking about how you could be using conceptual diagrams in your own research. So this is just a conceptual diagram illustrating a nutrient budget for a fish. They can be a great interface between scientists, the government, and community. So these are two diagrams showing the difference between impervious surfaces and pervious surfaces. You can very clearly see from these diagrams the benefits of putting pervious surfaces into a system. Conceptual diagrams can illustrate complex processes. So this is a diagram showing eutrophication in a marine system. So going from oligotrophic, and then as nutrient loading increases, you're seeing the effects on this ecosystem as it goes towards hypertrophic. So the water color is changing, you're having decreased biodiversity, you're increasing the amount of phytoplankton and algal species. So yeah, it's just a really great way to show these complex scientific processes. They can also effectively demonstrate comparisons between two systems. This is an example of installing a best management practice of stream bank fencing. So on the left, we have cows that have access to the stream. On the right, we've installed stream bank fencing. And you can just see the difference in nutrient and sediment loads with each of those practices. They can also describe processes at different scales. So here we have a mangrove ecosystem, and you can see what is happening in the ecosystem, and then you can also zoom in with these little blowouts and see what's happening on the microscopic scale, what's happening, on the scale of centimeters to really describe what is the total picture of this ecosystem. You can combine conceptual diagrams with photographs and maps. This is a photo of the coastal bays of Maryland looking towards Ocean City, and we can see that someone just put a conceptual diagram right on the bottom showing what is happening in below the surface of the coastal bays. Diagrams are an excellent management tool. So here we have a diagram where you're going from a healthy and productive ecosystem to degraded and unproductive, and you can see how if certain management actions are taken, how that could actually change the system and avoid from reaching that ecosystem tipping point. We can also use diagrams to educate the public. This is a very simple diagram showing the difference between a hardened shoreline and a living shoreline. And without a legend or any text accompanying it, you can easily see the differences between these two systems. You can also use diagrams to explain monitoring. This is a diagram showing all of the different groups doing monitoring throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And those can often be things that are hard to describe in text or quantify. And this is a really easy way to show, different ways of monitoring and where it's all happening in a watershed. And diagrams can be used in a variety of science publications, from newsletters, books, posters. Scientific journals are now accepting colored figures, so you can submit conceptual diagrams to journals. And once you've created a conceptual diagram, regardless of the medium, you can reuse them over and over again and adapt them to different audiences. So having a really great portfolio of science visualization pieces, including conceptual diagrams, are things that you'll be able to use for the rest of your career. So now let's talk about creating your own conceptual diagram. So as we talked about before, there are 7 main steps, and we're kind of just going to break those down into 4. So first, you want to start thinking about your audience, your base, and your symbols. And Ian has actually created a conceptual diagram worksheet that actually will guide you through that entire process. And once you've gone through that and kind of answered all of these questions and determined what base you need, what symbols, and what your main message is, you can start simple. Start with pen and paper. It's much easier to start with color pencils and paper than starting with this software. And then solicit feedback and review. So that's one of the most important parts of creating a conceptual diagram, is making sure that you're getting that input from stakeholders and peers about what you are showing. So as we said, start simple, start with color pencils, paper. You do not need to be an artist to do a conceptual diagram. I am not a trained artist. I have a science background. So often my conceptual diagrams are not that pretty when they're hand-drawn, but it's a great place to start. It's much less intimidating than getting to the software and having to create that base. So this is just a diagram of a coastal lagoon. So this person drew out their diagram, has all of their symbols listed, and then they started in the software. So they sketched out their base, added their water, made a list of their key features and factors. And then the most important part of creating a conceptual diagram is really soliciting feedback. You want to talk to your colleagues, collaborators, any key stakeholders, and recognize experts to make sure you're really portraying the information that you want to show in the diagram. And I think in science it's especially important to get a review of a diagram because different people have different ways of visualizing things. So you want to make sure what you're portraying is coming across the way you want it to. So this is just a diagram that was of the Maryland coastal bays. And this was kind of the first round of edits that they looked like, and it was revised and went through a second round of edits. A legend was added, which is extremely important. And then this was the finished product. So this is, after 2 rounds of edits, how this diagram looked in the final publication. So just to wrap up, conceptual diagrams are an extremely effective form of science communication because they provide context, visualization, and synthesis. They allow stakeholders to be engaged, and you can really create a shared vision of the diagram. And conceptual diagrams help you identify, data gaps, management priorities within your own research, and they can effectively communicate to a wide range of audiences, and they can be used, in many different mediums, and you can use and adapt them to different audiences.